6 years ago, neo-Nazis marched out of a field in Charlottesville, Virginia, literally carrying torches and neo-Nazi flags and spewing the same anti-Semitic bile that was heard across Europe in the 30s. In the process, a young woman was killed. And what'd you hear? There are very fine people on both sides. Come on. A reminder that hate never goes away, it only hides. Give it just a little bit of oxygen. It comes out from under those rocks with a vengeance. In the past several years, hate's been given too much oxygen, fueling a record rise in anti-Semitism. It's simply wrong. It's immoral. It's unacceptable. It's on all of us. It's on all of us to stop it. We must say clearly and forcefully that anti-Semitism and all forms of hate and violence have no place in America. And silence is complicity, and it cannot remain silent. I will not remain silent. You should not either. That's why today I'm releasing the first ever national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. It's the most ambitious and comprehensive U.S. government-led effort to fight anti-Semitism in American history. And it directs the whole of society, a whole of society effort in 4 key ways. First, increasing awareness and understanding of both anti-Semitism and Jewish American heritage. Second, improving safety and security for Jewish communities. Third, reversing the normalization of anti-Semitism and countering anti-Semitic discrimination. And fourth, building cross-community solidarity and collective action to fight hate. This strategy includes over 100 bold and unprecedented actions that government agencies are going to take to counter anti-Semitism. And that includes calls for action for Congress, state and local governments, companies, technology platforms, civil society, and faith leaders, all of them to act. Silence is complicity. All of us must stand united to affirm that an attack on any one group of us is an attack on all of us. This U.S. national strategy to counter anti-Semitism is a historic step forward. It sends a clear and forceful message. In America, evil will not win. Hate will not prevail. The venom and violence of anti-Semitism will not be the story of our time. We're committed. We're committed to restoring the soul of America, to restoring it together, and we got to get to it now.
Good morning. I want to thank President Biden and my wife, Vice President Harris, for the comprehensive actions that they are taking to confront anti-Semitism, bigotry, and hate in all of its forms. That is true leadership. Right now, anti-Semitic hate crimes in the United States are occurring at the highest rates on record. Hate crimes against Jews account for 63% of all religiously motivated hate crimes in the United States, even though we make up just over 2% of the overall population. At its core, anti-Semitism divides us. It erodes our trust in government, institutions, and one another. It threatens our democracy while undermining our American values of freedom, community, and decency. And anti-Semitism delivers simplistic, false, and dangerous narratives that have led to extremists perpetrating deadly violence against Jews. I know the fear, I know the pain, I know the anger that Jews are living with because of this epidemic of hate. And we've all heard the stories, and we know what they are. The students who've had swastikas drawn on their desks at school, parents who faced with slurs and obscenities as they dropped off their toddlers at a preschool, and the murder of 11 human beings at the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh. No one should have to live in fear because of who they are. And as the first Jewish spouse of a United States president or vice president, let me say this: we cannot stay silent. I will not remain silent. I will not stand idly by and allow anti-Semitism to poison our society. Last December, I hosted a roundtable at the White House with Jewish community leaders to discuss the rise of anti-Semitism across our nation, and more importantly, what we can do to counteract it. A few days later, President Biden established an all-of-government group to combat hate and to develop a national strategy to combat and counter anti-Semitism. Then in January, I had traveled to Poland with my colleague, Ambassador Lipstadt, to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day. But more importantly, or in addition, we also traveled to Germany to meet with special envoys from all across Europe to learn about their plans to safeguard Jewish heritage and combat hatred of Jews. That trip was also very personal to me. My great-grandparents escaped persecution from what is now Poland around 120 years ago. I got to see the home of where my family once resided before fleeing to the United States. And while they were lucky to escape, there were so many others who weren't. And my work continued after that trip. I spoke at the United Nations about the scourge of anti-Semitism. I hosted conversations with many different groups, college students, interfaith leaders, sports and entertainment executives, and members of Congress. We also convened special envoys from the European countries right here at the White House. Look, I never thought that I would be working on the safety and security for Jewish Americans and Jews around the world would be my cause. But now, more than ever, we must all rise to the challenge and meet this moment. So today, I am proud to join my colleagues, Ambassador Susan Rice, Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, and Homeland Security Advisor Dr. Liz Sherwood-Randall to release the National Strategy to Counter Anti-Semitism. The strategy is rooted in President Biden and Vice President Harris's agenda to fight hate more broadly, to strengthen our democracy, and to protect religious freedom. President Biden, Vice President Harris, and our entire administration are taking bold action to fight anti-Semitism and to foster Jewish life. The interagency group has mobilized more than 24 federal agencies, conducted listening sessions with more than 1,000 Jewish leaders, faith leaders, and civil rights leaders. Through a whole-of-society approach, we will build coalitions and work with key partners, Congress, state and local governments, civil society, schools and academic institutions, the private sector, and diverse religious communities to prevent and combat anti-Semitism at every level of society. In sum, this plan will save lives. Our work to counter anti-Semitism will not stop with the release of this national strategy. We are dedicated to its implementation. Anti-Semitism is a threat to Jewish communities and all Americans, and it can only be combated with united efforts. And we are committed to making sure that everyone can live openly, proudly, and safely in their own communities. It's on all of us to put an end to the visceral hate that we are seeing across our nation. We cannot normalize this. But lastly, let's not forget the joy that comes from celebrating our faith, celebrating our cultures, and celebrating our contributions to this great nation. There is so much more that unites us than divides us. And before I turn it over to my good friend, Ambassador Rice, I just want to thank you for all the work that you have done throughout your time in this administration on all issues, but especially these last few months for your incredible work and diligence on this plan, which is so meaningful to me personally and Jews across the world. And thank you so much for your service to this administration.
Thank you so much, Mr. Second Gentleman, for your leadership and for those incredibly kind remarks. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's special announcement. Like President Biden and the Second Gentleman, all of us here on stage, I take anti-Semitism personally. I grew up here in Washington, D.C., in a mixed Jewish and Black neighborhood. My family home used to belong to the Israeli embassy, and we kept a mezuzah on our doorframe. I learned prayers from my Jewish classmates and was welcomed at Passover Seders in their homes. I was fortunate to travel with my father and brother to Israel for the first time at age 14 and to visit Yad Vashem, Masada, and a working kibbutz. When I was ambassador to the United Nations and National Security Advisor, I witnessed the ugly impacts of anti-Semitism in the international arena. At the UN, I was proud to defend Israel against unfair attacks on its legitimacy and security. I embraced this role with passion because I loathe injustice. I loathe anti-Semitism, racism, and any form of hate. Jewish commitments to justice and tikkun olam, repairing the world, have long been sources of inspiration for me and the work that I do. But as the second gentleman has said in other contexts, we have a lot of tikkun to do when it comes to the dangerous threat of anti-Semitism. A firm and unrelenting response from government, business, and civil society is essential, and it's urgent. That's exactly the action this new U.S. strategy to counter anti-Semitism represents. It's the first and most comprehensive and ambitious national strategy to counter anti-Semitism in American history. Today, we're announcing over 100 new actions that the federal government will take in the next 12 months to counter anti-Semitism. We're also making more than 100 specific calls on Congress, state and local governments, the private sector, faith leaders, and civil society to join in countering anti-Semitism now and over the long term. Our strategy has 4 pillars. Let me dive into 2 of these pillars and share a few examples of actions we're announcing today. And White House Homeland Security Advisor, Dr. Liz Sherwood Randall, will address the other 2 pillars. Our first pillar is to increase awareness and understanding of anti-Semitism, including its threat to America, and to broaden appreciation of Jewish American heritage. 85% of Americans believe at least one anti-Semitic trope, according to the Anti-Defamation League. In 2020, a study found that more than 3 in 5 American millennials and Generation Z didn't know that 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. This is simply unacceptable. We have to increase school-based education about anti-Semitism, including the Holocaust and contemporary anti-Semitism, as well as Jewish American heritage. To that end, we're proud to announce that in 2024, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum will launch the first ever US-based Holocaust Education Research Center. What's more, the National Endowment for the Humanities will expand its investment in K-12 education on Jewish history through partnerships with independent organizations and other federal agencies. But our efforts to raise awareness about anti-Semitism and Jewish heritage must extend far beyond the classroom, to our workplaces and our communities. Under the national strategy, federal agencies have committed to incorporating information about anti-Semitic bias and discrimination into their diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility training programs. They've also committed to educating their networks about the many invaluable contributions of Jewish Americans to our country. The Department of Veterans Affairs, for example, will develop educational programs that highlight the diversity of veterans and the outstanding service of Jewish veterans. The Institute of Museum and Library Services will partner with the Council of American Jewish Museums to host a summit for museums, libraries, archives, and patrons on countering anti-Semitism. Another pillar of the strategy is focused on increasing cross-community solidarity and collective action to counter anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. When a gunman entered a synagogue in Colleyville, Texas, in January 2022, taking the rabbi and 4 worshipers hostage, a nearby Catholic church opened its doors to the hostages' families. Baptist and Muslim neighbors arrived to help. When the only mosque in Victoria, Texas, was burned to the ground in a hate crime in 2017, the town's sole rabbi handed mosque leaders keys to the synagogue. Such unity and allyship are critical. We can conquer hate, but only by joining forces together with one another. Together, we are greater than the sum of our parts, and that's America's unique comparative advantage. To foster unity and partnerships, the White House will recognize leaders of outstanding projects in the newly announced Ally Challenge. Americans will be invited to describe their acts of allyship with Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Sikh, or other communities that are not their own. The Department of Health and Human Services will also leverage the National Youth Sports Strategy and the President's Council on Sports, Fitness, and Nutrition to spotlight how activities like sports, fitness, dance, cooking, and volunteering can build community solidarity to counter anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. To support this whole-of-society strategy, today, organizations across the private sector, civil society, religious and multi-faith communities, and higher education are announcing new commitments to counter anti-Semitism. We encourage organizations across America to join them in taking meaningful steps to address anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. Tomorrow is my last day as the President's domestic policy advisor. It's been the greatest privilege to serve President Biden alongside my colleagues in the Domestic Policy Council at the White House and throughout the federal government. My parting request to those listening today is to do whatever you can in your communities, in your schools, your dorms, your houses of worship, your workplaces, to counter anti-Semitism and all other forms of hate. We all have to do our part. It's essential to preserving our democracy and national unity. And finally, I encourage you all to read our national strategy. The Biden-Harris administration is committed to ensuring its effective implementation and to leveraging it in our fight against all forms of hate. Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to my friend and close colleague, Liz Sherwood Randall.
Susan, thank you. I have to say, in honor of your extraordinary service in driving this initiative, we've got the con for you. We will take this forward. We will focus on that implementation as relentlessly as you would want us to focus on it. So as the President's Homeland Security Advisor, a position created just after 9/11, my job is to deal with the threat to our homeland that anti-Semitism represents. I approach this apolitically and agnostically. Apolitically, because countering discrimination and hate-fueled violence against any race, religion, ethnicity, or gender is not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. It's an American issue. Anti-Semitism is un-American. And I approach it agnostically because our democracy depends on our ability to ensure that every American of every religion is treated with dignity and respect and can worship freely without fear of persecution. For me, anti-Semitism is also personal. My great-grandparents fled oppression in Eastern Europe to build a new life in America where they could practice their faith without fear and seek opportunities denied to them in their homelands because they were Jewish. Still, my mother was chased home from elementary school in Omaha as a little Jewish girl. Her family moved west to seek a more open-minded and tolerant place. She met my father in Los Angeles, where they married and raised me, and my brother, in a community where we felt safe as Jews, at school, at temple, and at home. Nevertheless, my father experienced anti-Semitic discrimination long into adulthood. That discrimination was mercifully never violent, but it was real. And to confront it, he chose to build bridges from the Jewish community to other groups confronting discrimination and hate, including the Black and Asian communities in Southern California and beyond. He believed in Martin Luther King's dictum, the ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that by the good people. Or, as we say in our faith, we are obligated to do tikkun olam, to use our lives to heal a broken world. President Biden embodies that obligation, standing with the Jewish community. I can say this because I have known him since I was 26 when I first worked for him. He has a deeply rooted kinship with the Jewish people. He understands what we have faced, and he is determined that we should never face it again. So he has directed us to do everything in our power to confront the rising tide of anti-Semitism that we are experiencing today. Susan Rice just described 2 of the 4 pillars of our new strategy. I'll outline the remaining 2. In the interest of time, I'll just share the highlights, but I also encourage you to read the entire strategy, which will be available online. In Pillar 2, we focus on an issue that is felt urgently in Jewish communities across the country, the need to restore safety. Jewish Americans must feel safe walking to synagogue on a Saturday morning, wearing a kippah in public, or gathering for Shabbat on college campuses. Our strategy expands our work to improve the security of synagogues and Jewish institutions. For example, the Biden-Harris administration has increased funds to improve the physical security of buildings from $180 million 2 years ago to $305 million today. We've asked Congress to increase that funding further to $360 million. Additionally, the Departments of Homeland Security and Justice will reach out and meet with Jewish communities to ensure they are receiving and utilizing all the training and resources that are available to them. And we will continue to provide technical and financial assistance to build community-based prevention efforts that steer individuals away from hate and violence. For example, the Department of Homeland Security educates and trains people on how to identify indicators of radicalization and how to seek help. And when these efforts are unsuccessful, we will work with our law enforcement partners who are prioritizing the investigation and prosecution of hate-driven crimes against members of the Jewish and other communities. We've made substantial progress in this regard, including the establishment of a new domestic terrorism section in the Department of Justice. We have increased intelligence sharing from the FBI and DHS with our state and local partners, and we have launched an online prevention resource finder to provide a one-stop shop for everything the federal government can offer to support violence prevention. In Pillar 3 of the strategy, we focus on the hard reality that anti-Semitism is becoming mainstream and acts of violence against Jews are becoming normalized. We know this has a significant online element. Anti-Semitism is evident on social media platforms where anti-Semitic comments, tropes, and conspiracies are proliferating. Our new strategy sets forth a combination of federal actions, but the federal government cannot confront this challenge alone. Tech companies have a critical role to play. For that reason, the strategy contains 10 separate calls to tech companies to establish a zero-tolerance policy for hate speech on their platforms, to ensure that their algorithms do not pass along hate speech and extreme content to users, and to listen more closely to Jewish groups to better understand how anti-Semitism manifests itself on their platforms. The President has also called on Congress to remove the special immunity for online platforms and to impose stronger transparency requirements in order to ensure that tech companies are removing content that violates their terms of service. More broadly, Pillar 3 focuses on countering anti-Semitic discrimination in all sectors of American society. For example, the Department of Education today issued a letter reminding schools of their obligations to address discrimination. In the last 6 months, swastikas have been found carved into a desk at the Los Angeles high school that my nephew attends, and on a professor's door at President Biden's alma mater, the University of Delaware. The Department of Housing and Urban Development also issued a letter with guidance to fair housing programs on their responsibilities to enforce and adhere to non-discrimination against Jews and others. The Department of Agriculture is ensuring equal access to all USDA feeding programs for consumers with religious dietary needs, including kosher and halal foods. And 8 federal agencies are making sure that their partners across the country understand that the 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination based on shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics in federally funded programs and activities. Coming back to the lessons that I learned from my family's experience, fleeing hate and violence, starting new lives in a new land, and enduring skepticism and sometimes outright hostility, but always looking to lift up others and heal the world, I would leave you with this final thought. It is important to turn our understandable fear into empowering action. That is what we are doing today. I look forward to doing Tikkun Olam together with you in the days, months, and years ahead to strengthen our homeland security and to strengthen our democracy. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt. Thank you.
I stand before you today as the State Department's special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. I also stand before you in the role I occupied before entering government service as a historian. And it is in both those capacities that I say, this is a historic moment in the modern fight against what's known as the world's oldest hatred. For the first time, the United States government is not only acknowledging that anti-Semitism is a serious problem in this country, but laying out a clear plan to counter it. The collaboration among so many agencies and partners to reach this goal and develop these solutions is, simply put, breathtaking. But this moment is historic for another reason. Just consider where we are. We gather in a building that was once the home of the State and War Departments. We come together to release a plan for combating Jew hatred in a place where just over 4 decades ago, a form of Jew hatred took shape as official policy, as State Department officials erected so-called paper walls around this country to prevent Jews from entering our borders. We assemble with memories of a dark time when a White House staff counseled the president to stand firm against letting Jews in, when members of Congress sought to halt any liberalization of immigration laws even after Kristallnacht, when an intense bipartisan effort to allow the entry of Jewish children whose parents were in concentration camps was met with rejection and inhumanity. Even though a year later, when London was being bombed, Congress rushed to make room for British children to enter this country. You don't need my historical expertise to recognize the sole difference between these two sets of children. That was then. Today is very different. This plan, unveiled in this location, with input from dedicated leaders across this administration and beyond, reflects an unprecedented determination to fight anti-Semitism. It will shape and drive our effort at home. It will serve as an example and model for our partners around the world. Some already have national strategies of their own, many of them ready to draw on how we brought together so many agencies and organizations to propose solutions, adopt ideas, and work hand in hand to improve the lived lives of Jewish Americans. I'm exceptionally proud of this strategy and gratified for the opportunity to share it with you and the rest of the world. This could not be more essential because this scourge threatens not just the safety of Jews, but the strength of our democracy. Here again, history is instructive, telling us that where anti-Semitism persists, democracy suffers. Where Jews are at risk, so too are the rights of everyone from every race, religion, ethnicity, or creed. Yet, where communities and nations step forward to combat anti-Semitism, they tend to emerge more secure, more free, and more fair for all. In my faith tradition, the first words a Jew is supposed to utter each morning are thank you, modeh. Throughout the day, they are supposed to observe hakarat hatov, recognizing and giving thanks for all that is good. And so today, I too express thanks. On behalf of all of us who worked on this plan, we are so grateful to the thousands of Americans who shared their views and insights and deepest concerns. On behalf of my team at the State Department, I am so grateful that the precise anniversary of my first year as Special Envoy is marked by the issuance of this plan. When I entered office, I said that one of my objectives was to persuade people to take anti-Semitism seriously. This plan constitutes taking anti-Semitism seriously at the highest level of our nation. On behalf of the millions of Americans whose lives will be impacted by this immense effort, we give thanks to the many people, some of whom are in this room, on the podium, on the platform here with me, and some here, sitting here, who worked hours, days, weeks, and hours on this plan. I shall commit the cardinal sin, however, and if my colleagues forgive me, of singling out just one, in part because her tenure in the current office is about to end, and in greater measure because today simply would not have happened without her leadership, her resolve, and her vision. Ambassador Rice, Susan, you have many jewels in your crown of service to this nation. This, your latest, if we do the work, may well shine among the brightest, with the brightest among them. And now the real work commences, giving life to the words on these pages. The federal government has comprehensively laid out in great detail what it must do. We know Congress will enhance its existing commitment to this effort. But government cannot do this alone. We must have the broadest support of the American people, all the American people, not just on behalf of their Jewish neighbors and fellow citizens, but for the welfare of this nation and for the sake of democracies worldwide. With this plan, we give life to the rabbinic teaching, Lo alecha hamalacha ligmor, velo ata ben chorin levatel mimenu. You are not obligated to finish the task, but you are not free to turn away from it. Today, the United States government has shown that it did not and will not turn away from addressing something very ugly and deadly serious in our midst. Now we, all of us, are obligated to do the same. For if not now, when? And if not us, who? Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us on this historic day.